Just past midnight, Karen Whitmore, the overbearing HOA president, called demanding I drive over an hour from Lincoln City just to hand her the clubhouse keys. Her obsession with control and relentless enforcement of petty rules made every encounter a test of patience and endurance. But instead of obeying blindly, I outsmarted her with a clever move, leaving the keys in a lockbox and reclaiming my autonomy. Just wait until you see how Karen's midnight fury backfired, and why justice finally prevailed in this unforgettable showdown. It was just past midnight when my phone vibrated insistently on the nightstand, cutting through the quiet hum of my apartment. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize, blinking with that particular kind of urgency that immediately sets your teeth on edge. Normally, a late-night call might signal an emergency or a friend in trouble, but this number, I already had a sinking feeling I knew who it was when I answered. The voice on the other end was exactly what I had dreaded. "Hello?" I said cautiously, my voice hoarse from sleep. "Finally!" barked Karen Whitmore, president of our local HOA, her tone sharp, impatient, and unmistakably commanding. "I need you to drive all the way from Lincoln City tonight and bring me the spare keys to the community clubhouse. Now!" I froze mid-breath. I could hear the faint click of her heels against a polished floor through the phone, as if she were standing in her living room, pacing and expecting me to jump to obey. Lincoln City was over an hour away, and the sheer audacity of this demand made my blood run hot. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, trying to reconcile the voice on the phone with reality. Was this really happening? Was Karen actually calling me at 1 a.m, demanding that I drive across towns in the dead of night? Because she wanted something she could just as easily retrieve herself. Karen had always been difficult. That much was undeniable. She took her role as HOA president far too seriously, treating minor infractions as though they were crimes against humanity. She wielded her authority like a scepter, delighting in micromanaging every aspect of neighborhood life. A crooked garden gnome, a mailbox slightly askew, a car parked 2 inches over the line. Any excuse would do to assert her dominance. She thrived on enforcing rules nobody had agreed to and punishing residents for things that most people would barely notice. But this call was different. This was personal, and it cut deep. The audacity of expecting someone to abandon their home in the middle of the night to cater to her whims was beyond reason. The unfairness of it struck me like a physical blow, the kind of injustice that makes your jaw clench and your hands tremble just a little with suppressed frustration. I could almost feel her smirk through the phone, certain that fear or compliance would make me obey. I sat in silence for a moment, my mind spinning. Anger started as a simmering heat, slowly creeping into every thought. How could she think it was acceptable to harass someone at this hour? Did she believe her self-appointed authority gave her the right to disrupt lives simply because it suited her? I thought about the countless times she had cornered neighbors with petty fines, the sly ways she made people feel guilty for minor mistakes, and the sharp, almost gleeful tone she used when enforcing her rules. A picture of the neighborhood clubhouse flickered in my mind. The building was modest, just a single-story community space with worn wooden floors and a dusty piano in the corner. There was nothing urgent about it, nothing that required someone to drive over an hour at midnight. The rational part of me wanted to explain that to Karen, to calmly remind her that a reasonable solution existed. But the voice on the phone didn't leave space for reason. She was already barking orders, expecting compliance, and every word carried the weight of her self-importance. My heart started racing as the anger escalated, turning into that sharp, focused fire that makes your fists clench and your mind refuse to back down. It wasn't just about the call. It was the pattern, the years of small tyrannies, the relentless control, the subtle intimidation she wielded over everyone in the neighborhood. Karen wasn't just a difficult person. She was an obstacle, a constant source of unnecessary stress, and at that moment, she was demanding an impossible favor as if it were perfectly normal. I could hear her continue talking, listing excuses and reasons as if any hesitation on my part would be a personal betrayal. Every word chipped away at my patience, and I felt the full surge of indignation welling up inside me. How dare she? Who did she think she was, treating neighbors like personal servants? Who gave her the right to invade someone's time, energy, and safety with a whim? The anger was sharp, hot, and undeniable, and in that moment I realized that I wouldn't be intimidated. Karen Whitmore could bark and demand, but this time she had misjudged her audience. My hands tightened around the phone, my eyes narrowed, and somewhere deep in my chest a spark of defiance ignited. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quiet. Karen had overstepped, and I knew it. I felt the fire of righteous anger surge through me, a clear signal that something had to change. Tonight would not be about compliance. It would be about resistance, about proving that her unchecked authority had limits, and about reclaiming the dignity she had tried to crush. The phone call ended abruptly with Karen satisfied, or so she thought. But I sat there in the dark, staring at the blinking screen, my anger simmering into something that promised action. This was not the end. This was just the beginning. I sat back in my chair, the glow of my phone fading into the dim light of my apartment, and tried to make sense of what to do next. Driving over an hour to Lincoln City in the middle of the night was not only inconvenient, it was risky. The roads were quiet, empty and often winding, and fatigue could turn even a short drive dangerous. Yet the thought of outright refusing Karen's demand felt just as intimidating. Her temper was legendary among the neighborhood, and ignoring her orders even politely could trigger a wave of petty punishments, fines, or passive-aggressive tactics she wielded like a weapon. I thought back to previous encounters with her, each one replaying in vivid detail. There was the time she had tried to tow my car for unauthorized parking, even though I had followed all the posted rules. I had returned from work to find a warning slip on my windshield, her signature scrawled across it with that smug satisfaction she always seemed to carry. Then there was my neighbor, Lisa, who had innocently added a small, tasteful garden decoration, a bird bath, to her front yard. Karen had fined her for disrupting the visual harmony of the community, an arbitrary decision meant to assert her authority. The stories weren't rare, they were constant, a tapestry of control that Karen wove across the neighborhood, suffocating anyone who dared to live life on their own terms. The thought of compliance filled me with unease. I could see myself behind the wheel, groggy and frustrated, driving through the darkness simply to satisfy her ego. And yet resistance carried its own weight. Karen had perfected the art of passive intimidation. Even a simple no could be twisted into defiance, and defiance in her hands often became a source of punishment for weeks to come. My mind churned with this dilemma, a mix of anxiety and simmering indignation. Every option seemed to lead to discomfort, humiliation, or danger. As I stared into the dark corners of my apartment, a sense of helplessness began to creep in. Her obsession with control wasn't just a quirk. It was systemic, ingrained, and relentless. Every rule she enforced, every fine she issued felt like a lock around the neck of the neighborhood, a reminder that questioning her would come at a cost. The weight of the injustice pressed down, suffocating in its intensity. I felt trapped in a system designed not to protect residents but to make them bend to a single uncompromising will. Pain and frustration intertwined, and I realized how deep her influence ran. Tonight I wasn't just a resident. I was a pawn in her personal theater of control, yet even in the thick of that frustration, a flicker of possibility emerged. The sting of being ordered around, of being expected to drop everything at a moment's notice, began to crystallize into a thought. Maybe I didn't have to obey blindly. Maybe there was a way to navigate this situation that didn't leave me exhausted, humiliated, or at her mercy. My mind, fueled by anger and indignation, started mapping possibilities, imagining small ways to subvert her authority without confrontation. I thought about the spare key she demanded. I had a duplicate, cleverly stored for emergencies. Instead of making the drive, perhaps there was a way to deliver it that would leave her frustrated and powerless, without me putting myself in danger. The thought brought a small, cautious spark of hope, a way to reclaim a little control from someone who thrived on domination. For the first time that night, the suffocating tension in my chest loosened, replaced by the beginnings of a plan, and yet the weight of the injustice remained. Karen's presence, even over the phone, was oppressive. Her insistence, her entitlement, and her skill at manipulating fear and guilt reminded me of the challenges still ahead. But somewhere under the pain and frustration, the thought lingered. This might be an opportunity not just to resist, but to turn the tables entirely. Tonight the narrative could change and I could choose how it ended. The darkness outside my window felt less threatening now, less like an obstacle and more like the backdrop for a quiet, deliberate rebellion. My heart was still heavy with indignation, but it had shifted from raw helplessness to a calculated resolve. The pain of being targeted by Karen Whitmore was real, sharp, and personal, but it was also suddenly something I could harness. For the first time that night I smiled, small and cautious, as I imagined her reaction to a night that would not go according to plan. The discomfort remained, yes, but the spark of hope had arrived, and with that hope came the sense that the tide was about to turn. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, letting the anger and frustration of the past hour settle into something colder, sharper, and more focused. The phone call with Karen Whitmore had left my nerves frayed, my blood simmering with indignation. Yet amid the tension, a thought had started to take shape. I didn't have to follow her orders blindly. There was a way to meet her demands without surrendering to her control. For the first time that night, hope flickered like a candle in the dark. I pulled my phone back to my ear and forced my voice into a calm, agreeable tone, the kind that disguises hesitation as compliance. "Sure, I'll be there," I said, careful to sound cooperative. "But give me 20 minutes to get ready." I could hear the immediate sharpness in her retort. Karen didn't like delays. She thrived on urgency and intimidation, the kind of energy that made you feel like a misstep could trigger a storm. But I wasn't planning to rush to her. Not tonight. My mind was already racing through possibilities, plotting a route that gave me leverage without confrontation. I set the phone down and moved quickly. Weeks ago, anticipating the kind of arbitrary demands Karen often made, I had duplicated the spare key to the community clubhouse and stored it in a secure location. That foresight, which had seemed almost trivial at the time, now became the cornerstone of my plan. I grabbed the key, tucked it safely in my jacket pocket, and slipped into my car. My heart beat faster, but it wasn't fear, it was the excitement of reclaiming a bit of autonomy. The drive itself was short but deliberate. I didn't head straight to Karen's house. Instead, I navigated to a nearby parking lot, hidden from view, the kind of quiet spot few people passed at this hour. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as I parked, thinking about the layers of control Karen wielded over the neighborhood. She had relied on fear and compliance for so long, but tonight, that influence was about to be challenged. This small act, simple yet deliberate, felt like the first step toward turning the narrative in my favor. Pulling out my phone, I typed a message carefully, choosing words that would be perfectly factual and non-confrontational, yet subtly assertive. "The keys are outside in the lockbox. You can get them yourself." I hit send and leaned back in my seat, a mix of anticipation and quiet triumph swelling inside me. I imagined her reaction, first confusion, then irritation, perhaps even a sense of powerless frustration. For the first time, Karen wouldn't get her immediate gratification, and the balance of control subtly shifted. The hope that had begun to form earlier now solidified into a tangible feeling. Karen's power had always been rooted in her ability to command, to manipulate fear, and to demand obedience. By acting strategically instead of reacting impulsively, I had found a way to reclaim some authority. It was empowering, almost intoxicating to realize that her influence wasn't absolute. The thought that I could navigate her demands without confrontation, without endangering myself or bending to her whims, filled me with a quiet exhilaration. For the first time that night, I felt the heavy weight of injustice lift slightly. The anger was still there, simmering in the background, but it had transformed. Instead of being a paralyzing, bitter force, it had become fuel for action. I had chosen a path that balanced caution with cleverness, compliance with independence, and in doing so, I had opened a space for hope to grow. As I watched the blinking cursor on my phone after sending the text, I realized that this moment wasn't just about keys or one midnight demand. It was about reclaiming control, about proving to myself that manipulation and unreasonable authority could be met with calm, deliberate strategy. The night was no longer just a scenario of fear or frustration. It was a chance to act, to think, and to outmaneuver an obstacle that had long loomed over the community. I settled into the quiet of the parking lot, the night still around me, and for the first time felt a sense of possibility. Karen Whitmore, with all her bluster and self-importance, was no longer dictating the course of this evening. I had hope now, a spark of optimism that things could turn in my favor, and the knowledge that with careful planning, even the most unreasonable demands could be met on my terms. The sense of empowerment was thrilling. A quiet victory in the shadow of midnight, and it lit a fire that promised the night was far from over. The morning sunlight streamed through my bedroom window, warm and unassuming, while the events of the night before replayed in my mind like a secret victory. I sipped my coffee slowly, listening to the faint hum of the neighborhood waking up. The normal rhythms of life continuing as if nothing had happened. Yet, beneath the quiet of the morning, a subtle shift had taken place. Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, had spent the night pacing her house, muttering about the audacity of residents, and the story of her midnight demand, paired with my quiet, calculated defiance, had already begun to ripple through the community. By mid-morning, the whispers had turned into conversation. Neighbors I had barely spoken to stopped by, offering nods, smiles, and small expressions of acknowledgement. They shared stories of past encounters with Karen, tales of petty fines and sudden rules, each recollection reinforcing the sense of collective frustration. And suddenly they were talking about me, about the way I had handled the situation. Calm, strategic, and defiant without confrontation. Their admiration was tangible, a quiet but powerful recognition that even someone as imposing as Karen could be met with wit and intelligence, and that her threats were not absolute. As I walked through the streets later that morning, I noticed subtle changes. People held themselves a little taller, greeted each other with a sense of solidarity, and even smiled when passing my house. The oppressive tension that Karen had cultivated for years seemed to lift, if only slightly. It wasn't just about the keys or the late-night drama. It was about realizing that control, no matter how entrenched, could be challenged without losing composure. Karen, of course, was furious. I could imagine her pacing, rehearsing her complaints, and muttering about the unfairness of it all. Yet there was also a quiet defeat buried beneath her indignation. A realization, whether conscious or not, that she could not bend everyone to her will. The invisible chains she had used to manipulate compliance and fear had broken, at least in one instance, and the neighborhood had witnessed it. The most profound realization, however, was personal. As I reflected on the events, I understood that the night had not been about defiance for its own sake. It had been about courage, the courage to refuse to be intimidated, to think critically under pressure, and to act with strategy instead of impulse. It was about asserting personal boundaries in a situation designed to erode them and discovering the power that comes from self-determination. That sense of empowerment was liberating, and it extended beyond Karen's demands. It became a reminder that reason, preparation, and confidence could dismantle the most crushing forms of authority when wielded wisely. I also realized that the ordeal had taught me more than just how to handle one difficult person. It had revealed a strength I had not fully recognized before. The ability to navigate tension, anticipate consequences, and act decisively without losing integrity or calm. The experience left me inspired in a way that went far beyond neighborhood politics. It reminded me that every challenge, no matter how intimidating, carries within it the potential for growth, insight, and triumph. By the end of the day, I had made a quiet vow to myself. I would not allow unreasonable authority to dictate my life. I would stand firm when logic and fairness demanded it, and I would act strategically rather than reactively. Karen would no longer be the symbol of fear she had tried to cultivate. Her calls at midnight never came again, and the neighborhood slowly began to breathe easier, as if a weight had been lifted. In the end, it wasn't about the keys, it wasn't about compliance or defiance. It was about voice, agency, and self-respect. It was about proving that intelligence and patience could prevail over entitlement and coercion. And it was about discovering that within each of us lies the power to resist injustice with dignity, creativity, and courage. That night had started with anger, frustration, and fear, but it ended with clarity, strength, and inspiration. A lesson not only for Karen, but for myself and perhaps for everyone in the community who had silently endured her rule. The sun continued to rise and the neighborhood carried on, ordinary yet transformed. I smiled, knowing that justice, subtle yet complete, had been quietly restored, and that I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident than ever.